November 7, 1943. Somewhere over the English Channel, a 22-year-old from Ohio named William Roach is having the worst navigation experience of his short military career. He is not lost in the way a tourist gets lost. He is lost in the way that people die. The weather came down fast. His formation scattered. His flight leader has already crash-landed on a beach somewhere. Another pilot is in the North Sea. Roach is alone, low on fuel, flying dead reckoning through deteriorating visibility over territory that could be friendly or could be very much the opposite. The fuel gauge tells him he has no time for uncertainty. He spots an airfield through the overcast. The runway looks right. The orientation is roughly correct for England. The R-2800 engine behind his propeller is not going to wait while he cross-references a map. He puts the landing gear down, sets up his approach, and makes a perfectly competent landing. He follows a ground vehicle to a parking area, shuts down, begins his post-flight checks. He is in France. German soldiers are walking toward him with weapons drawn. Before we go on, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if you're loving this story, subscribe, because tomorrow we have something extra special waiting for you. William Roach, Lieutenant Yusuf, 22 years old, is now a prisoner of war. His aircraft, a P-47 Thunderbolt he has named Beetle, is now German property. The Luftwaffe moved within hours. Allied fighter bombers prowled at medium altitude, looking for exactly this kind of windfall. Beetle was refueled, checked, and flown east before any American search could find it. It arrived at Rechlin, Germany's most classified testing facility, repainted in German camouflage, assigned the code T9+FK, and transferred to the Wanderzirkus Rosarius, the traveling demonstration unit that took captured Allied aircraft to frontline German bases to show pilots what they were actually fighting. And now it sat on a runway, waiting for the man they'd sent to evaluate it. His name was Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche. He was the Luftwaffe's most experienced evaluator of captured aircraft. He had flown over 100 different types. Soviet fighters, British bombers, American prototypes. His reports were known for one quality that made him unusually valuable and occasionally inconvenient to his superiors. He told the truth. When an enemy design was better than German intelligence had assessed, Lerche documented it. When his own country's aircraft had a flaw, he wrote it down. His superiors had not always appreciated this quality, but his expertise was too valuable to silence. He had read the intelligence briefings on the P-47 before walking out to the tarmac. Those briefings described a crude, mass-produced approximation of a fighter, a machine that relied on a massive engine to compensate for poor aerodynamics, something a nation built when it should have been focusing on real aircraft. One mechanic on the ground crew had called it a flying milk bottle. Fat, clumsy, the unmistakable product of a country that makes refrigerators. Lerche stood in front of Beetle and felt something his career had trained him to take seriously. He felt suspicious. Not of the aircraft. Of the briefings, Lerche did not rush. He never rushed. He had a procedure for evaluating captured aircraft built over years of exactly this kind of work, and he followed it without shortcuts even for machines he already knew, especially for machines he didn't. The first thing he noticed, standing in front of Beetle on the Rechlin tarmac, was the size. The P-47 was enormous by European fighter standards. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 radial engine dominated the nose the way a bull's head dominates a bull. The fuselage, built around it like a barrel, was wide and deep. The landing gear was planted on the tarmac with what could only be called structural confidence. Two thick legs spread wide apart, looking over-engineered, looking almost comically heavy. Everything about the aircraft read as excessive, as a deliberate refusal to prioritize weight and drag. Lerche walked to the perimeter. The panel gaps were perfect, not approximately correct. Perfect. The welds were clean. The fasteners were countersunk with industrial consistency. The paint sat on a surface that had been prepared with a care Lerche had not consistently seen on German production aircraft by late 1943. He had flown German aircraft recently where the rivets didn't quite align, where a hatch sealed slightly wrong. where you could tell, if you knew what to look for, that the factory was under pressure. That quality control was bending to keep production schedules. This aircraft, built in Farmingdale, New York, staffed largely by workers who had been doing this for 18 months, matched the construction quality of Recklin's best pre-war German production. In some respects, it exceeded it. He noted this. He climbed into the cockpit. And here is where the document he wrote that evening diverges from almost everything you might have read about this aircraft. He did not find it elegant. He did not find it intuitive. His first impression, recorded in his own memoir decades later, was that the P-47 cockpit could baffle an experienced pilot on first acquaintance. His exact word, baffle. The cockpit was large in a way that felt wrong to someone shaped by thousands of hours in German fighters. Everything was further away. The controls were arranged according to a different operational logic. The instruments were grouped differently, labeled in English, organized around assumptions Lerche had never been trained to make. He sat with it for several minutes before his engineering instincts took over from his conditioning. He stopped asking what was wrong with this layout. He started asking why it was designed this way. Cockpit was large because it was designed for a man who would be in it for 8 to 10 hours. German fighter doctrine, optimized for intensity over duration. Short intercepts, quick sweeps, missions measured in minutes of actual combat over familiar terrain. German cockpit design followed from this, tight, precisely organized, built around a specialist who knew every switch by feel. The P-47 cockpit was not built for that specialist. The seat had real padding. There was room to shift position over a long sortie. A young man from Oklahoma, who had been flying for 13 months, escorting bombers from England to the German border and back, could work this cockpit for a full day and arrive home in a state where he could think clearly enough to land. Lerche examined the instruments. The gauges used color coding, not just numerical markings. Green for normal operating ranges, red for warning zones, clearly delineated on every engine instrument. A pilot under stress, a pilot who hadn't slept, a pilot 3 hours into a mission where something had gone slightly wrong, could glance at any gauge and know in under a second whether the engine was healthy. Green continue, red problem, no arithmetic, no memorization of precise threshold values. German instruments required you to know the numbers. The exact oil pressure value above which something became concerning. The precise temperature ceiling. This was rational if your pilots had 200 hours on type before combat, if they had internalized those specifications the way a craftsman knows his tools. It was not rational if your pilots had 13 months of total experience and had converted to this aircraft 3 weeks ago. Lerche wrote this distinction down carefully. The P-47 instrumentation was not designed for mastery. It was designed for safety under conditions of imperfect knowledge. Germany had asked, how do we give our expert pilots the best possible performance information? America had asked, how do we give any qualified pilot enough information to keep this aircraft in the air and bring it home? 2 questions, 2 philosophies, 1 war. The throttle, mixture, and propeller pitch controls were clustered together logically. The fuel system was clearly labeled. The checklist assumed nothing and explained every step. Lerche had read the BF-109G manual. One of its landing instructions read, essentially, be careful, with no further elaboration. The pilot was expected to understand what careful meant because a pilot who didn't wasn't ready to be in a 109. The P-47 manual described the landing sequence step by step, not elegant. But a pilot who forgot a step could find it in seconds. A pilot who made a mistake on approach could recover. The 109 killed pilots who weren't good enough for it. The P-47 was an aircraft that tried not to. He started the engine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders in 2 radial rows, caught immediately. Then the sound. Lerche would describe it specifically in his memoir. Smoothness. Not the roughness that had become, by late 1943, an occasional companion on German aircraft. Not the vibration that tells an experienced pilot the manufacturing tolerances on this particular engine were pushed to hold a production schedule. He had context for this that most observers lacked. Allied bombing had been disrupting German raw material supply chains for over a year. Forced labor in German factories, concentration camp workers, POWs, conscripts, working under conditions that had nothing to do with precision manufacturing, meant quality control was eroding in ways the official reports didn't fully capture. He had flown German aircraft where the engine developed a rough spot after 10 minutes, where an automatic system needed manual attention, where something was slightly wrong in a way the pre-flight check hadn't revealed. The R-2800 did not develop a rough spot, it simply ran. Lerche taxied toward the runway. Another revelation. The ground handling was easy. Dramatically easier than the Bf-109G, which was notoriously demanding in exactly this moment of any flight. Narrow landing gear, limited forward visibility, the constant low-level threat of a ground loop if attention drifted. German accident records contained a dispiriting number of 109 losses that occurred not in combat, not to enemy guns. To the gap between what the machine demanded and what the pilot could reliably provide on their own airfield in the middle of an otherwise uneventful day. The P-47's landing gear was wide, almost comically wide in photographs. The tailwheel locked. The aircraft tracked straight down the taxiway. A pilot returning from 4 hours in the air, tired, possibly managing minor battle damage, could bring this machine to a stop without the thin margins the German fighter demanded. He lined up on the runway, advanced the throttle. The acceleration was better than the weight suggested. The takeoff run was longer than a German fighter, meaningfully longer but not operationally limiting. The aircraft lifted cleanly. Gear retracted smoothly. At low altitude, Lerche was honest. The P-47 was not fast down low. Around 480 to 500 kilometers per hour at sea level, a 109G running at full power would run away from it with daylight to spare. He noted this precisely and without drama. The weakness was real. A professional evaluation that papers over genuine limitations is worse than useless. Then he climbed. Above approximately 400-500 meters, something changed. The General Electric turbo supercharger mounted in the rear fuselage, driven by exhaust gases, using engineering that American manufacturers had refined systematically through the 1930s, began to transform the aircraft's performance. It allowed the enormous engine to maintain near sea-level power delivery in air so thin that other engines were suffocating. German fighter engines, at 7,000 or 8,000 meters, were operating at perhaps 70 or 75% of rated power. The R-2800 was running close to full output. The American heavy bombers, the B-17s and B-24s, flew their combat missions at 7,000 to 8,500 meters. That was where German flak was calibrated. That was where the fighter intercepts happened. That was the altitude where the air war over Germany was actually being decided. At that altitude, the aircraft that Lerche had been told was slow and underpowered was performing close to its specification, while German interceptors, throttled back by thin air, came up to meet it at degraded power. He tested the dive. The weight that looked like a liability became something else entirely. A heavy aircraft in a dive accelerates hard and carries that acceleration. Luftwaffe pilots had already been filing combat reports describing P-47s evading pursuit simply by pushing the nose down and running. Battle-damaged aircraft that should have been easy kills, pulling away from interceptors. The reports were circulating. Now Lerche felt it directly. The aircraft in a dive was genuinely fast. Roll rate was excellent for its size. The controls remained responsive rather than stiffening under aerodynamic load. He flew for 90 minutes total. Stalls, rolls, simulated combat maneuvers, extended engine-out procedures at safe altitude. He tested everything. The hydraulic system operated smoothly every time he used it. The fuel system was logical. The flaps deployed symmetrically. When he tested a simulated emergency procedure, the checklist worked exactly as written. Nothing surprised him negatively. Not once in 90 minutes did the aircraft do something unexpected, something requiring quick corrective action, something revealing a gap between design assumption and operational reality. And somewhere during those 90 minutes, Lerche understood he had been asking the wrong question. German engineering philosophy had trained him to ask, which aircraft wins the dogfight? That was not this aircraft's question. Aircraft's question was, which aircraft is actually in the air over the target on Tuesday after a hard Monday? Which aircraft brings its pilot home when it absorbs damage? Which aircraft can be maintained by a mechanic of ordinary skill working in a French field, with parts from a different production batch? Which aircraft can a 14-month pilot land safely at the end of an 8-hour mission? By those measures, the measures that actually determine the outcome of a sustained air campaign, this aircraft was not inferior. It was not even close. It was operating according to a different strategy, and the strategy was winning. That evening, Lerche sat at his desk at Rechlin and began to write. The report followed the standard Luftwaffe technical evaluation format: performance characteristics, handling qualities, systems assessment, strategic implications. The first 3 sections were professional, factual, and precise. He documented the low-altitude speed disadvantage without softening it. He documented the high-altitude performance advantage completely. Climb rate, dive acceleration, roll rate at various speeds. All of it there, supported by specific observations from the flight. His reports had always been like this. That was why people read them. The 4th section carried the weight. The P-47, Lerche wrote, represented a fundamentally different design philosophy from German aircraft. German design optimized for peak performance and assumed expert pilots with careful, experienced maintenance support. The P-47 optimized for operational reliability and assumed pilots of average skill maintained under field conditions. This was not a crude design. It was sophisticated engineering applied to a different set of requirements. The Americans had not attempted to build the best fighter. They had built the most operationally sustainable fighter, and they were producing it in numbers that German industry could not approach. His recommendation was direct. German fighter design philosophy must incorporate operational reliability as a primary requirement, not a secondary characteristic that yielded whenever performance was at stake. A primary requirement given equal weighting with speed and maneuverability on the grounds that an aircraft consistently in the air was more valuable than an aircraft theoretically superior when it managed to get there. He signed the report, submitted it through standard channels. 3 weeks later, he received a response. It did not dispute a single technical data point. It disputed his conclusion. The P-47 was a crude American design. German engineering was superior. The pilot who had written this assessment had been flying enemy aircraft for too long and had allowed his professional objectivity to be compromised. His conclusions were filed as overly pessimistic. He was not the only one. Between 1942 and 1944, dozens of German engineers, test pilots, and operational commanders wrote assessments identifying specific vulnerabilities in German air power that the enemy was systematically exploiting. Reports on the declining quality of replacement engines coming from factories under strain. Reports on rising accident rates among undertrained replacement pilots. Reports on operational readiness percentages dropping at frontline units where, on any given day, a German fighter wing had significantly fewer aircraft actually flyable than its nominal strength suggested. The reports existed. The data was accurate. The recommendations were professionally sound. They contradicted a national mythology. Germany had built its self-image around engineering supremacy, around the conviction that German quality beat American quantity, that the professional beats the amateur. Lerche's report said otherwise. The system could not receive it, but the war could not be filed. By the end of the war, American factories had produced 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts, not over a decade. In 3.5 years of wartime production, Germany, across the entire war, produced approximately 33,000 single-engine fighters of all types, all variants, all the 109s and 190s and everything else, with production continuously disrupted by Allied bombing, raw material shortages, and the progressive hollowing out of the skilled workforce that precision manufacturing requires. 33,000 aircraft across 6 years of rearmament and war, 15,683 Thunderbolts alone in less than 4. Now apply the operational readiness rates Lerche had identified. A P-47 group with 100 aircraft on its roster typically maintained 85 to 90 aircraft available for operations on any given day. The robust airframe absorbed damage and returned to service. Reliable engine required standard maintenance rather than specialized intervention. The wide landing gear reduced ground accidents on return from damaged landings. Non-availability ran at 10 to 15% and reflected genuine mechanical maintenance, not systemic failure. A German fighter unit with 100 aircraft on its roster by 1944, by conservative accounts from Luftwaffe operations records, often had 60 to 70 aircraft actually flyable. Sometimes fewer. Demanding airframes required skilled maintenance that was increasingly unavailable. Replacement parts from different production batches needed fitting and adjustment. Fuel shortages forced extended ground time. Quality problems created write-offs that never appeared in combat loss statistics. The aircraft technically present on the strength, but unavailable for operations, were invisible in the briefings. They were very visible in the actual combat strength appearing over the target. Multiply production numbers by operational readiness rates. You get combat power at the point of contact. Not paper strength, not what the order of battle says, what actually arrives. The P-47 flew 746,000 total sorties during the war. It ended with an aerial kill ratio of 4.6 to 1. 4 German aircraft destroyed for every Thunderbolt lost. That ratio does not reflect pilot quality in isolation. German pilots in 1943 and early 1944 were frequently as skilled, or more skilled individually, than the Americans opposing them. The ratio reflects the multiplication of numbers and operational tempo that Lerche's report had described. An enemy that could sustain losses and replace them faster than Germany could replace its own. Robert Johnson, one of the men flying these missions, was 22 years old and had been flying for 13 months when he entered combat. On one mission in 1943, his aircraft absorbed more than 20 20mm cannon hits and over 100 rifle-caliber rounds. The engine was partially destroyed. The cockpit was damaged. He flew it back to England. He landed. He walked away. He flew again the next morning. He finished the war with 28 aerial victories, more than any other American pilot in any theater of the war. He flew P-47 Thunderbolts his entire combat career. Think about what that means for the mathematics of an air war. An aircraft that returns its pilot to fight again and again and again. Hans-Werner, one of the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring aces with 220 victories, described his encounters with P-47s in post-war testimony with a precision that Lerche would have recognized immediately. The aircraft could absorb an astounding amount of firepower, Baer said, and had to be handled very carefully in combat. He was describing the experience of shooting at it. The implication that structural toughness made the machine difficult to destroy even when accurately engaged was precisely what Lerche had documented after his walk-around. One man spent the war trying to kill these aircraft and found them stubbornly resistant. The other had sat in one for 90 minutes and written down why. They were describing the same engineering choices from opposite ends of the gun sight. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, was given the option to convert his unit to P-51 Mustangs when they became available. He declined. His reasoning, documented in debriefs and later interviews, was essentially what Lerche had written in November 1943. A single rifle caliber round through the Mustang's cooling system could force a landing within minutes. The same round hitting the P-47's air-cooled radial might change nothing at all. Zemke knew his pilots. He knew what brought them home. He chose the aircraft that did it most consistently. The 56th finished the war, having claimed 677 aerial victories, more than any other American fighter group in the European theater. They flew Thunderbolts by choice. Here is the forensic summary. The Luftwaffe did not lose the air war because its pilots lacked skill. The evidence of individual capability, the kill ratios of the top aces, the testimony of Allied pilots who encountered them establishes without argument that German fighter pilots were among the finest aviators of the 20th century. They did not lose because their aircraft were technically inferior in pure performance terms. The Bf-109G and FW-190A were, by objective engineering measure, excellent machines. They lost because they were fighting a war of attrition with a philosophy designed for a war of decision. They lost because they built aircraft for experts in a war that required aircraft for everyone. They lost because their production system could not replace losses at the rate American factories could. They lost because their operational readiness rates fell while American rates held. They lost because the philosophy that had produced the finest air force in the world in 1939 was precisely wrong for the kind of war the conflict became after 1942. Hans-Werner Lerche sat in a captured American aircraft on a November afternoon in 1943 and saw all of this. Not because he was exceptional, though he was, because he was a professional doing his job honestly, asking the right questions, following the evidence where it led, writing down what he found even when what he found was uncomfortable. He climbed down from Beetle after 90 minutes. The ground crew gathered around. What did he think of the flying milk bottle? He looked at the aircraft for a moment. Then he said, "It is the best designed operational I have ever flown. Not the fastest, not the most maneuverable, not the most lethal in a one-on-one engagement under ideal conditions, the best designed." The word that mattered was operational. His commanding officers read the report he wrote that evening. There were discussions. There was disagreement. The conclusion contradicted a national mythology. And in a state where contradicting official consensus about German superiority carried professional and sometimes personal consequences, national mythologies tend to survive the facts. The report was filed. The Thunderbolts kept coming. Beetle, T9 plus FK, serial number 42-22490, formerly of the 358th Fighter Squadron, last flown in Allied colors by Lieutenant William Roche before France turned out to be France, flew on with the Luftwaffe until 1945. It went to the Circus Rosarius. It traveled to frontline bases and was shown to German pilots who studied the cockpit, the instruments, the landing gear, the engine. They were shown everything Lerche had documented. What they were not shown was how to build 15,000 of them in 3 years. That was the lesson the aircraft could not teach on a runway. Lerche survived the war. He wrote his memoir. He described those 90 minutes with the precision and honesty that had characterized his entire career. The smoothness of the engine, the stability of the landing gear, the operational logic underneath the unfamiliar cockpit layout, the high-altitude performance the briefings hadn't mentioned. He did not write with bitterness. He wrote the way a professional writes about a problem he diagnosed correctly and watched develop exactly as he predicted, in a context where being right did nothing for the outcome. Germany produced excellence. America produced availability. In the kind of war that 1939 became by 1943, availability won, not glamorously, not through individual heroism, through production rates and operational readiness percentages and sortie tempo. Numbers that tell the truth about wars even when the official histories prefer a different story. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not the finest aircraft of the Second World War. By the narrow measures of pure performance, speed, climb rate, turning radius, it was not even the finest American aircraft of the war. The P-51 was faster. The P-38 was more capable in certain roles, but the P-47 was the most available. It showed up most consistently. It absorbed the most damage. It brought its pilots home most often. It could be produced in the numbers that an industrial war actually requires. Lerche recognized this in 90 minutes and wrote it down with the honesty of a man who had spent his career saying uncomfortable things to people who preferred comfortable ones. His reward was to watch his predictions come true as the institution that employed him collapsed around the evidence he had already filed. That is the verdict. Not on the aircraft, on the war. William Roach came home in 1945. He had spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner in a camp somewhere in Germany, while the aircraft he accidentally donated to the Luftwaffe flew demonstration tours for the men trying to kill his friends. He had made a navigation error over the English Channel on a bad weather day and paid for it with years of his life. The aircraft absorbed that error and survived intact, which was, in the end, exactly what it was designed to do. That's our story. If you enjoyed it, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell, and tomorrow more stories are waiting for you. Thanks for watching.